This week's European fixtures. Primeira League Portugal. Moreirense vs Vitória SC. Nacional vs Sporting. Benfica vs Tondela. Aero UKAA vs Rio Avenue. Famalicão vs Gil Vicente. Porto vs Casa Pia. Braga vs AVS. Estrela AMA Dora vs Alver CSA. Spanish La Liga. Real Betis vs Alaves. Mallorca vs Celta Vigo. Atletico vs Elche. Levante vs Barcelona. Osasuna vs Valencia. Real Sociedad vs Espanyol. Villarreal vs Girona. Oviedo vs Real Madrid. Athletic Club vs Rayo Vallecano. Sevilla vs Getafe. French Ligue 1. PSG vs Angers. Marseille vs Paris FC. Nice vs Auxerre. Lyon vs Metz. Lorient vs Rennes. Strasbourg vs Nantes. Toulouse vs Brest. Le Havre vs Lens. LOSC vs Monaco. Italian Serie A. Genoa vs Lecce. Sassuolo vs Napoli. Roma vs Bologna. Milan vs Cremonese. Cagliari vs Fiorentina. Como vs Lazio. Juventus vs Parma. Atlanta vs Pisa. Udinese vs Verona. Inter vs Torino. Bundesliga. Bayern vs RB Leipzig. Leverkusen vs Hoffenheim. Union Berlin vs VfB Stuttgart. SC Freiburg vs Augsburg. Heidenheim vs Wolfsburg. Eintracht Frankfurt vs Werder. St. Pauli vs Dortmund. Mainz vs Köln. Mönchengladbach vs Hamburger SV. Eredivisie. Go Ahead Eagles vs Sparta Rotterdam. PSV vs Groningen. Telstar vs FC Volendam. Heerenveen vs Twente. Utrecht vs Excelsior. NEC vs NAC. Ajax vs Heracles. English Premier League. West Ham vs Chelsea. Man City vs Spurs. Bournemouth vs Wolves. Burnley vs Sunderland. Brentford vs Aston Villa. Arsenal vs Leeds United. Crystal Palace vs Forest. Everton vs Brighton. Fulham vs Man United. Newcastle vs Liverpool. This weekend's standout fixtures in the major European leagues. In England, Man City takes on Spurs in the early Saturday afternoon kickoff. Leeds travel to London to face a confident Arsenal side who overcame Man United on the opening week of the new season. Newcastle vs Liverpool ends off the second week, and this tie has the potential to explode because of the surrounding the transfer of Isak from Newcastle to Liverpool. Last season champions PSV entertain Groningen, however we don't see any issues for PSV in this game. The mighty Bayern Munich plays RB Leipzig at the Allianz Arena. This game has the potential to be a real spectacle of football, and we could see Xavi Simons playing his last game for RB Leipzig. In Italy, Inter plays a Torino side who is hoping to have a much more fruitful campaign than the last. Champions Napoli will run out against Sassuolo, hoping to continue their winning streak. Remember to like and subscribe.